Great Responsibility, Chapter 34, That Falling Feeling. Piper would never say it out loud, but there was a time she was afraid of heights. When she'd first moved into the family levels of Stark Tower, she couldn't stand on the balcony outside or at the edge of the windows without feeling slightly nauseous. Then she'd been bitten by a radioactive spider, and everything in her life had shifted. Now, normally, when she fell, she did it on purpose, throwing herself off of ledges and buildings and racing through the city on a web line. But at the moment, her web shooters were at the bottom of her backpack, in the secret compartment with the rest of her costume. She closed her eyes as that feeling that she hadn't felt since she was bitten took over, wind rushing past her face. She wondered if her dad had seen her falling, or if he would only realize she was gone when she was being scraped off the sidewalk. Then something caught her around the waist, and another familiar feeling took hold. The feeling of swinging through the air. She opened her eyes, and a chest covered in what looked like black, intricately webbed spandex filled her vision. On instinct, she wrapped her arms around the figure that had caught her. There was a chuckle.
"You all right, miss?"
That voice sounded so familiar, but Piper was just too busy being happy that she wasn't dead to place the voice of her rescuer. How? She looked up and saw that there was a black web line connected to the far side of Stark Tower. They were currently hanging about 16 feet above the sidewalk that was currently embroiled in chaos. The Avengers were fighting a group of AIM scientists that were throwing fireballs from their hands. More extremist soldiers set on avenging Aldrich Killian. It looked like the Avengers had this well in hand, so Piper looked back into the face of her rescuer. The mask looked very similar to her own, but the eyes blinked and moved like a regular face did, only there was no mouth. Maybe it was the gaping white eyes that moved like normal ones, or the lack of nose and mouth, but it was kind of creepy. Though that could have had something to do with them still just hanging midair on a web line that was, now that she got a closer look, most definitely coming from this guy's wrist.
"You didn't answer my question. Are you all right?"
Piper nodded, slightly dumbstruck. "I'm okay. Thanks." Her spidey sense went crazy, and she held on a touch tighter as he pulled them up on a web line, narrowly avoiding a ball of fire.
"I need both my hands, okay?"
"Hang on tight." Piper nodded. There was no way she was even going to slip, thanks to her powers, but he didn't know that. He was extra careful as he swung them up to the top of Stark Tower. He set her down carefully, and the eyes of his mask seemed to smile as he perched on the railing.
"Stay safe, beautiful."
He brushed her hair out of her face and seemed to smile again before he tipped back and free fell over the side of the building. Piper raced to the edge to try and see where he was going, but he was already gone when she peered over the edge. She swore and raced to the entrance and down the stairs. The elevators were locked down. She made it in record time to the lobby where the rest of the students were milling about, taking photos of the aftermath of the fight. Sam spotted her first and rushed over to her.
"Piper! Oh my God, you're okay."
The others circled her, rapidly asking questions before Pepper, bless her, intervened.
"Miss, there's a medical crew here to make sure you're okay. Standard procedure."
Piper nodded and followed Pepper out of sight of her classmates. As soon as they were out of sight, Pepper wrapped Piper in a bone-crushing hug. Piper hugged her back and sighed as Pepper ran a hand through her hair.
"You gave us all a heart attack there, Piper."
Piper glanced down at her feet as Pepper led her over to the medical professional. "Everyone?" Pepper smiled slightly.
"Yeah, everyone. Steve's wrangling your dad, so he won't give you away. Expect a lot of worried faces at dinner tonight."
Piper grinned.
"I'm all right, I promise."
Piper smiled and hugged Pepper again before letting the resident doctor give her a quick once-over. Soon she had joined back up with the group. Tony came back to the group when the fighting was done, this time being supported not so subtly by Captain America in a torn-up t-shirt and jeans. He was still holding his shield, and many more camera flashes went off from the group as Tony cleared his throat and spoke.
"Sorry, kiddies. Like we're done with our tour for the day. Is everyone all right?
His eyes lingered on Piper, and she nodded as someone stepped up next to her. He continued on a very rehearsed-sounding speech about how being a supervillain bent on revenge was bad. Cap adding things here and there, but Piper had heard similar speeches so many times she just tuned them out at this point. Instead, she looked up and smiled, relieved to see Harry standing next to her. As they began to trickle back outside to get back on the bus, Piper grabbed Harry's hand and pulled him aside.
Where were you? Are you okay? I didn't see you anywhere when we were evacuating.
Harry chuckled.
Piper, I'm not the one who fell out a window. Pretty sure I should be asking you if you're okay.
He brushed her hair behind her ear and smiled at her. Miss Quinn called for them to follow the rest of the class, and Harry turned to leave before he noticed Piper hadn't moved.
You coming, beautiful?
Piper's mouth dropped open, and her brain, finally coming down off the adrenaline high that came from nearly falling to her death, finally put two and two together. The only thing she could think as Harry took her hand and led her to the bus was, what the fuck? Chapter 35. Dream. Piper didn't have a chance to talk to Harry that day. After the debacle at Stark Industries, the students had been taken back to school and checked over by the school nurse. Piper got called into the principal's office, and Coulson questioned her about the Spider-Man. She faked ignorance the whole time. Her detention rolled around, and she was back in her lab, pulling apart the backs of the heads of the last few LMDs she had to reprogram. She was in costume, of course, like she always was while on the helicarrier, for which she was glad when Dr. Connors walked into her lab unannounced. She waved to him from where she sat, connecting the heads of two LMDs, a book open between them. It was the book she had found at her parents' house, minus the photo of them, of course. She flipped over the mess of wires as the download began and grinned under her mask. Dr. Connors beat her to the book, though, scooping it up off the floor and gently flipping it over and reading the title. The Theory of Cross-Species Genetics. An interesting read. He handed it over to her.
Though not really a theory anymore, since you exist.
Piper shrugged. I just think it's interesting, and it's still technically theoretical, since DNA splicing is still out of technological reach for at least a while. I was an accident. Nobody meant for me to happen, not even me. Dr. Connors smiled. A happy accident, at least. I'm sure most of the city would agree. Piper sighed and set down the book. She couldn't help but notice that Dr. Connors' eyes followed it. She set it down on its front cover, and he was looking at the picture of the author on the back cover. A young man with black hair and pale skin and glasses. Did you know him? Dr. Connors nodded and sighed.
Dr. Octavius. I did, actually. We were roommates at MIT. I wanted to use science to help the world. He did, too. We spent many a night planning ways to make the world better.
Dr. Connors sighed.
When we graduated, he went off to Oscorp, and I never heard from him again. I spent some time at Stark Industries, made some friends there, a wonderful couple, the Parkers. They worked at Stark Industries for a while, but for some reason they went to Oscorp. I never heard from them again either.
He looked up and saw Spider-Girl had frozen. She was standing stock still in the middle of the room, her hand reaching for the book. Slowly, she looked at him. He couldn't see her face, but something was definitely wrong.
Spider-Girl? You all right?
Slowly, almost mechanically, she moved, turning to face him fully. Her voice was strained.
The Parkers?
Dr. Connors nodded.
Yes, Richard and Mary Parker. Are you all right?
Spidey stuttered as she tried to reply and failed. It had been so long since she'd talked to anyone who knew her parents. Or so she thought. She'd never really asked Tony about them. It had all been too fresh at the time, and after that, it just never came up. She slowly and carefully stepped over to the door, clicking it closed. Did you know them well? The Parkers, I mean. And Dr. Connors nodded.
I worked closely with Richard for a few years. Mary was in security until she went on maternity leave.
Piper was still facing the door. So you knew she had a baby.
Did you know it was a girl? Dr. Connors was getting a bit nervous. He'd never seen any of the teens act like this before. But despite this, he nodded. I did. I was actually at their baby shower. Piper grabbed a table and pulled it in front of the door. Dr. Connors frowned. He didn't think she would do anything to hurt him, but this was a bit odd. What are you doing? Spider-Girl sighed. I don't want anyone coming in here who doesn't already know. I am curious, though, how many people are privy to the identities of the teen heroes in Fury's program? Dr. Connors raised an eyebrow, now more curious than nervous. It's highly classified. Almost no one knows. As far as I know, only Director Fury, Agent Coulson, and Agent Hill know. I'm not high enough clearance level. Piper sighed. Well, you're about to learn one, at least. Still facing away from Dr. Connors, Piper reached up and pulled off her mask. Slowly, she turned around. Dr. Connors, my name is Piper Parker, and I have a few questions about my parents. Harry was asleep. He had to be. This was too perfect to be real. Piper was curled up next to him, sitting on a black couch he'd never seen before. They were watching one of Piper's favorite science shows. He had an arm wrapped around her. Everything was perfect. A dark voice echoed around him as Piper fell asleep in his arms. It could be like this all the time. The couch changed, and now Harry was standing, looking at Piper, still sleeping in a mass of black that was curling around her, tendrils breaking off. A face swirled out of the blackness. Sightless white eyes and sharp-pointed teeth smiled at him. You just have to give in to us. Give in, and we'll give her to you. Harry stared back at the thing. His suit, the living piece of slime he'd found on his piano, the thing that gave him the power to face up against people who could beat Spider-Girl and win. It smiled, teeth like needles peeking out from behind a maw almost as wide as the face that held it. Harry started backwards, almost falling, but something caught him. He looked up into his father's face. His father smiled, something he normally only saw around Piper. I'm proud of you, son. The face of the suit was back, sharp teeth smiling over his father's shoulder. You could have all this and more. Just say yes. Bond with us. Harry jerked backwards. Suddenly he was sitting up in bed. His watch sat innocently on his bedside table. He clicked it open just to check. The slime was sitting in the watch, unmoving until he touched it. Just a dream, then. He sighed and curled back up under his blankets before drifting back off to sleep.